Tom, great to see you. And we're going to be talking about agricultural commodities today, but obviously, really a very specific set within those. But just so we get a context, because these are unusual markets, could you maybe explain where these sort of the major agricultural commodities, the likes of wheat, etc., fit into the overall commodity complex? And what are the main attributes and differences of this versus the other commodities? Because there are some particularly sort of peculiar aspects within this market.
Right, right. Well, thank you so much, Roger, for having me. So agricultural commodities are definitely one of the key components of the commodities markets. And compared to other commodities, shortages in grains and oilseeds in terms of supply could directly impact food security and have wide-ranging impacts, especially in countries that actually rely on the imports. Now, in addition, this could result in inflated global food and meat prices, which obviously affects quite a large audience. So furthermore, there's uncertainty around plantings and weather when you consider agricultural commodities that, with regard to weather, there's some level of predictability, but there's obviously some uncertainty that comes into play there, which I think is a bit different than some of the other commodities. And once unfavorable weather or other factors actually that affect planting actually occur, it could take a couple of years for that supply to kind of rebuild and for grains and oilseed stocks to rebuild from that.
And then the other thing within this is that, where people are in equity markets and even fixed income markets are used to the sort of being banks and a few corporates, sometimes retail, etc. But could you maybe explain who the major players are, and not just the major players in terms of the sort of the buyers and the sellers, but also the major regions within this space as well?
Yep, absolutely. So, in terms of producers and exporters, there's quite a lot of countries, but really around the Americas, Black Sea countries like Russia and Ukraine, some European countries, and Australia. Those would be the major exporters and producers, obviously. And in the Black Sea region in particular, 20% of global corn exports are going to come from that region, 30% of wheat exports, and then about 80% of sunflower oil exports in the global market come from that region. Now, in terms of import countries, Middle East and Africa take up a large segment, as well as some Asian countries and some European countries also that import quite a few veg oils. So the pause in the Ukrainian exports that's occurred due to the war has obviously had a big impact on these importing countries and what they're able to receive. And in addition, besides just maybe, let's say, the regions where plantings and imports and exports are big, a lot of the agricultural commodities trading companies, some of the major ones would include Bunge, Cargill, Louis Dreyfus, just for a few examples.
Maybe if you could just sort of, there is this historical context which you talked about a little bit, but what have we been used to historically? So when we always talk about these, what have been the defining factors for these major agricultural commodities that we've been used to prior to this year?
So historically, we're looking at obviously production and consumption. So on the supply side, there are several factors that are kind of always there, I would say. So input prices would be one. So in terms of what's the cost of fertilizer, the cost of production, these are the things that farmers have to think about when they're planting. Adverse weather is obviously a big one that's always going to be there. So extreme temperatures, drought, and in some cases extreme flooding or some other weather anomaly that occurs, that's always going to be there, always something that we're thinking about. And in addition, outbreaks of, let's say, pests or diseases that could actually impact either the quality of a crop or the production. Now, on the other side, so consumption, strong economic growth could always affect prices, increasing usage of biofuels or grain-based ethanol, government policies, and other kind of economic factors such as import and export taxes. So those, I would say, are kind of the standard ones that we're always monitoring.
And then today, you know, there are these other factors in there. I mean, are we actually seeing other real factors, or that we're just seeing extreme versions of the ones you just mentioned? So what are the, if we are adding the key drivers that we care about today that are throwing a spanner in the works into this already complex system, what are they?
So the ones that I mentioned, like weather, green energy policies, economic growth, those are still there for sure. There's a couple of unique ones that we're going through right now. One being the pandemic and kind of results from that. So lowered consumption coming from slowed economic growth or lockdown measures. In addition, labor shortages that are actually impacting production. So we saw this in Malaysia, where some labor shortages there actually resulted in impacts to production. The other big driver is obviously the war in Ukraine since February, with the Ukrainian exports being blocked via the Black Sea ports in that region. It obviously resulted in very tight supplies and shot prices up to all-time highs. Now, since then, there's been an agreement to resume grain shipments from Ukrainian Black Sea ports. So prices have begun to decline, and this should ultimately result in some increased global supply in the short term as that sort of resumes again. But in general, besides the normal things that we're always watching, the pandemic and the war in Ukraine have definitely been some additional factors.
And I guess the sort of that all-important question in many ways now is, what does this supply-demand balance or imbalance look like sort of for the next 12 months? Because there's been a lot of talk, but we've seen prices go up, prices come back down. So it feels like we're sort of back to where we were. Is that the case, or are there imbalances that you can see on the horizon?
Well, I think definitely that there are some things that we're still watching. So supply issues, as I've mentioned, in Ukraine, also in the U.S., we're kind of in the heart of the corn and soybean season. So we're still watching weather in August, which is highly impactful. The forecast right now looks hot and dry, so there could be some additional reduction in production in that region. And then, of course, we head right into the South American season and monitoring supply there. So it's been warm and dry recently there. So we obviously need to monitor long-term weather and see how soil moisture and all these other weather factors look as we head into the season. And then, of course, really highly impactful, as I mentioned, is what's going on in Ukraine. So the exports being resumed out of Ukraine Black Sea ports indicates that a large amount of Ukrainian shipments from earlier this year will provide the market with additional supplies for wheat, corn, barley, and sunflower oil and meal, or sunflower seed and oil. Now, in addition, the new crop, wheat and rapeseed, that will come to the market from Ukraine shortly will also further alleviate supplies in the shorter term.
And then, in terms of looking forward, that 12 months out, what sort of things could impact supply and demand there? I mean, are we going to have things like issues around fertilizer? And I guess, whilst no one can predict price, etc., it feels like there's a lot of factors, which means that in what can be a volatile asset, it looks like volatility might be something that we have to live with, because there's all these variables that could, again, change. What are you looking at that could be the big things for that sort of next coming 12-month period?
Yeah, yep. So I definitely would agree with that. Weather's obviously one of them, as I've mentioned. The war, obviously, what's been going on recently in terms of exports has been one factor. The other one would be the amount of production coming out of the region. So both wheat and corn production out of Ukraine looks to be down significantly from last year based on the impacts going on in the country. So, that is something that we would definitely be monitoring. In addition, some larger scale items, obviously fear of recession, continued supply chain issues that continue to be kind of a fallout from the pandemic, and even other large scale climate factors such as ENSO, which is El Nino Southern Oscillation, and how that impacts different regions of the world and what that could mean for supply. That would definitely be kind of some other factors that we'd be looking at into next year.
So to sum up there, basically, it sounds like we're in a scenario where things feel like they've kind of almost not got back to normality, but the sort of things have price-wise have sort of normalized a bit. But we're at that point where all these factors, many of them still very, very much exogenous factors like El Nino, any one of these could cause quite a significant impact on these major soft commodity prices.
Absolutely. So there's definitely a variety of different things to continue to watch and to continue to see how these interact with one another. That's really quite important. So I definitely agree with that.
So for people who want to kind of just keep in touch with prices, with all these movements, is there somewhere on sort of LSEG Refinitiv's platform they can look for all this information?
Absolutely. So we have Icon for Commodities, which is our main platform, and that consists basically everything that we do as a group goes in there. So we have weather commentaries, we have our crop production forecasts, information and insights on agricultural flows. That's all accessible through several different pages and applications within Icon for Commodities.
Brilliant. Thank you very much, Tom. Great insights, and obviously it's going to probably be pretty key in this world where geopolitics has taken the front pages. So fingers crossed that it doesn't turn out to be too dramatic.
Yes, totally agree. Thanks so much for your time. Really appreciate the questions today.